Hey everyone, and welcome to Mrs. Crop's classroom. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more about magical realism, more specifically the difference between magical realism and urban fantasy. Is there really a difference? So here we are again talking about magical realism. The first thing that I want to remind everyone is what magical realism is. So magical realism is when you have a realistic fiction, but you also have these fantastical elements that are seamlessly interwoven in something that is otherwise realistic. So we're not talking fantasy. A fantasy would have a different world. It would have these magical elements. It would have creatures and powerful beings and gods and goddesses. It could be mythological. It could be based on religion. It could be a wholly new world with beings that we don't even know of yet until you read the fantasy. Realistic fiction takes place in our world. Real cities, real people, real places, and real events all take place within a realistic fiction. Now, don't get this confused with having a city that doesn't really exist be part of a magical realism story, because you can have a made-up name for a very realistic city that could exist today. Because again, we are talking fiction here. But it's not a completely made-up world. There are no changes in physics. There's no difference to the regular working of things. It's just every now and then you have this very unrealistic thing that happens, but it's also treated like it's normal. So some examples of magical realism seen in real literature. Someone got so hot and they're so angry that they're feeling this burning sensation inside them just welling up, and then it explodes. But there's an actual explosion in the story. Like the house caught fire and now all the other characters in the story are having to put out the fire. No one's really worried or wondering why this person self-combusted. They're just putting out the fire and they go, oh yeah, he was really angry, like he made a fire. So again, magical realism, it's odd, but it is beautiful to read, okay? So now we're talking about a new type of genre, which came about in the early 90s. Thank you so much, J.K. Rowling, for coming up with what we now call urban fantasy. Now, we call it urban fantasy now, but when the series first came out, it was not. There was no other place to put this Harry Potter novel except for in magical realism. So a lot of times people, when they're talking about magical realism, they will bring up Harry Potter. Now, then there's another group of people who, ever since we created the genre in 1997 for urban fantasy, they'll say, no, it's not magical realism, it's urban fantasy. But the thing is, there's so many things that are similar between the two that it's easily to confuse them, and it's still argued in the English society now whether or not something fits in one or the other or both. So I'm going to get into some of those tricky instances now. One of the reasons that people claim separate the two is that in an urban fantasy, you have two separate worlds. You've got the people who continue to live everyday life, like everything is normal, and then you have a secondary magical or mythological world on the outside. This is going to bring a lot of things to mind. Harry Potter, the Mortal Instruments, Percy Jackson, all of these are going to be the urban fantasy. However, the reason that they're lumping them all together is because they're so magical or so fantastical. They have so many of these other elements that it's too much for a magical realism story. But wait a minute. The founding father of magical realism created an entire novel called 100 Years of Solitude, where the fantastical elements and mythological elements continue throughout the entire novel and never ceased. The reason the main character can live forever is in fact because he's from a very mythological place, the Fountain of Youth. So when you look at that, you go, wait a minute, that novel is definitely magical realism because he was the father of magical realism, and he had those same elements. He had a story that was chock full of mythological concepts and ideas, and the magic was seen constantly through that story. So why is it that that's magical realism and Harry Potter is not? Just because there's this veil between the Muggle world and the magical world doesn't necessarily mean that it's not magical realism. However, this is the other side of the debate. The difference between the magical world and the real world actually constitutes a creation of a separate world like you have in a fantasy. So then we have the urban fantasy. It's more like a fantasy, but you have that reality or urbanness put on top of it. Whereas in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, you don't necessarily see a separation between the two worlds. You definitely see a lot of mythological elements. You definitely see a lot of fantastical elements, but the characters are always constantly together. There's no separation of the world. So another thing that people like to use to separate urban fantasies from magical realism is the concept that magical realism a lot of times is fantastical elements without a source of mythological creation. So a lot of times you will have people crying rivers or bursting into flames or time stopping, but there's no connection to a mythological element. But in urban fantasy, you often see things like werewolves and witches and vampires, and these are all very heavily found in mythology and in different fantasy stories and things like that. So it seems easy to go ahead and go, okay, so if you see a witch, a warlock, a fairy, or a werewolf or a vampire, I think I already said werewolf, if you see any of those things, then obviously it's urban fantasy instead of magical realism. But angels and demons are going to fall into this mythological bubble, and one of Marquez's very famous magical realism stories is A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, which is clearly about an angel. And it's never blatantly stated that he's an angel, and he is definitely not part of the world, and everyone is very shocked about the intrusion of this creature. But he is definitely a mythological figure. It is a statement of mythology, of religion, into this other world. So if angels in Marquez's story can be considered magical realism, why is it that angels in The Mortal Instruments is not? It's a good question. So again, you see that there's a blur between the two. Now, I'm not trying to say that there's no such thing as urban fantasy, because ever since Harry Potter came out, we have seen a huge rush of stories that follow the same pattern, where it does take place in the 21st century, where you do have a separate world that is separated from the norm. However, I think that to argue that there's nothing magical realism about these stories is naive, because again, we didn't create the stories in the genre. The stories were created, and then wonderful English professors and theorists and teachers decided to categorize what was already created. And this is how this works. When Marquez's work came out, there was no such thing as magical realism. It wasn't until after his stuff became popular that people started to figure out, where do we put it? And then we came up with magical realism. And just like that, all these other novels started coming out where you saw similarities between fantasy and magical realism. And so we came up with a new genre that was called urban fantasy. I believe personally that they are more overlapping than people give them credit for. So the point of this video is to really show everyone how English is a very fluid profession and how it's all about your take and interpretation on genres and on texts and storylines and characters. And while in high school you may see that there's always one right answer because we are cursed with standardized testing, I would love all students to understand that English is really more about discourse and more about conversations and discussion, and we're really trying to focus on what can you argue, what do you see, and how can you back it up. So I kind of hope this helps you understand the differences between magical realism and urban fantasy. And I also hope it helps you understand why sometimes the lists of what is one thing and what is the other are not the same. Again, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Please check us out next week.
Hey guys, Jessica Senesac here. Just wanted to say thank you to all of you for watching today's video. Please remember to check the description below for any links and information on upcoming videos and any other cool information we have hidden over there. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We need you so that we can keep making our videos. Thanks again for watching, guys.